If you ask someone that only knows a small amount about the library of the Genesis, especially in the United States, one of the things that they'll probably come back with if they're asked to describe it is that they'll say that it's sports heavy. And sure, there were a lot of sports games released for the console, certainly more than, say, the Super Nintendo. Although, to be honest, that number might be a bit closer than you might think. Based on some quick and dirty math on my part, in the United States, 20% of the Genesis library could be considered sports games. But on the other hand, 18% of the Super Nintendo's library was also sports games. So next time someone wants to hand you that boring old complaint about the Genesis, just make sure to remind them that there's plenty of sports games on their side of the house too. Just because no one remembers Sterling Sharp's End-to-End or Bassin's Black Bass with Hank Parker, that doesn't mean that they didn't exist. Anyway, enough console wars talk. Those are supposed to be over now anyway, right? That's what people keep saying. Let's move on and talk about a 31-year-old game instead. With that large of a sports game specific library, you probably expect that I cover all of the major sports fairly regularly on Zilog and Moto. And I do. This year alone we've done football, basketball, boxing, soccer, rugby of all things, and there's even a golf outing scheduled in the near future. You might notice, however, though, that I haven't reviewed a baseball game yet this season, and seeing as how we're right in the middle of the World Series, as I'm putting this together, I thought that this would be the perfect time to address that shortcoming. However, I should probably pause for a second, because, I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me, and you're now confused because you can't name 18 sports games for the Super Nintendo, much less 18% of the library. Well, hi, my name is Dave, and I think that says a lot about the quality of the Super Nintendo sports library, doesn't it? Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Today's game, R.B.I. Baseball 94, is one that also did not appear on the Super Nintendo, at least not directly, although a version of it was ported to the SNES the next year with updated rosters and retitled Super R.B.I. Baseball. R.B.I. Baseball 94 would be the last edition of R.B.I. Baseball to appear on the Genesis, and at first, that might seem a little strange with it releasing in April of 1994 to coincide with the beginning of the 1994 Major League Baseball season. And at that point, the Genesis still had a few years of sports titles to go from the likes of Sega and Electronic Arts and Acclaim. So what happened? Well, as mentioned, R.B.I. Baseball did continue on the Super Nintendo the next year, and it also continued on the 32X with R.B.I. Baseball 95. But during all of that, Time Warner, who owned Atari and Tengen, decided to merge everything into a new company called Time Warner Interactive. And after the release of R.B.I. Baseball 95, Williams Entertainment bought Time Warner Interactive, and Williams had a standing agreement with Acclaim via Midway to release Midway titles on consoles, so because of that agreement, Williams Entertainment killed off the R.B.I. Baseball franchise as to not compete with Acclaim's new Frank Thomas Big Hurt Baseball. Did you get all that? There will be a quiz later. So is R.B.I. Baseball 94 a fitting swan song for the series on the Genesis? Or does it follow in the roots of the truly pathetic previous year's offering of R.B.I. Baseball 93, which only escaped getting a bomb rating from me due to being, functional? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of R.B.I. Baseball 94 for the Genesis. This is a decent condition copy, definitely some scratching and nicks to the outside, but it doesn't appear to be overly abused, and the hang tab is still intact at the top. The inner cover looks good, no sun bleaching or water damage, but if you look closely at the back, you can see some slight brown tinting on the white, which indicates that this might have been informally a smoker's house. One final note on that inner cover, if you look at the spine, note how offset the Tengen logo and title are. Apparently, whoever was manufacturing this for Tengen had some quality control issues at the time, because I checked on eBay and saw some copies that were like this, some that were centered properly, and then some that were offset the other way. I get that mistakes happen, but this just seems lazy, and maybe a clue as to why Tengen/Atari was about to get bought out by Time Warner. As one might expect, this is a relatively inexpensive title in the catalog to pick up, but with it being the last entry in the R.B.I. baseball series released for the console, I do tend to see it in the wild slightly less than some of the other games, and I think the price reflects that, with it averaging between $12 and $15, and honestly I was expecting to see a lot of sales for $10 or less. As far as the front cover goes, it's fine. Honestly, I like the fact that it has artwork instead of a photo cover that had the MLB logos airbrushed out. It feels like a bit higher level of effort to have had someone draw Red Sox era Roger Clemens than to just slap any old picture on it. And that's totally who that is. You can't convince me otherwise. Unlike R.B.I. Baseball 93, the 94 edition actually got official releases in PAL regions and South Korea, and I definitely prefer the European cover, which removes the red banding. Unfortunately, that cover didn't make it to Australia, and I can't believe they signed off on that. That's just a terrible, quick and dirty mismatch of the red banding format and the old Mega Drive logo. Definitely a special release, and not in a good way. Flipping over the back, and like the artwork on the front, they got this right. Layout that doesn't try to do too much, but has well-written bullet points on the left, pictures on the right, and split down the middle with the new baseball card style player artwork from the game. No notes here, but we'll just pretend that old Lenny Dykstra is not there. One thing I'll mention though, there is a small feature here that I like where the game doesn't just create some random 162 game schedule, it's actually the real 1994 schedule, supposedly. So theoretically, if you bought the game in April of 1994, you could play along with whatever team you chose in real life. Or at least you would have been able to if there wasn't a certain large-scale labor strike that wiped out the 1994 season in August. Opening up the package, and like the outer cover, the manual and cartridge are, fine. Good enough for an old sports title anyway. As far as the manual goes, it does a good job of explaining how to play the game, but honestly, anyone that was already familiar with the R.B.I. baseball series before this game will be able to pick it up and play immediately, as there really haven't been any meaningful changes to gameplay. One thing that I think is nice, though, is that at the end of the manual, they included stat charts for all the players on not just the current teams, but also the historical teams, and I really appreciate them including that as a quick reference. It's especially nice if you're trying to pick out players for the Home Run Derby, as otherwise, you wouldn't know the player's stats until you pick a team to use. Okay, that's the package. Let's play some ball and hope for an improved experience from R.B.I. Baseball 93. But I'm not getting my hopes up. If you saw my review of R.B.I. Baseball 93 back in episode 205, you probably understand why I said I'm not getting my hopes up in regards to the quality of R.B.I. Baseball 94. But if you didn't see that video, I'll save you the trouble, because I know it's tough getting people to care about one sports game review from the 90s, much less two. My problem with R.B.I. Baseball 93 was that it was effectively a carbon copy of R.B.I. Baseball 4. And don't get me wrong, I understand that reusing assets is a tale as old as time. Just ask anyone who's tried to play FIFA on the Wii. But R.B.I. Baseball 93 was literally the exact same game as R.B.I. Baseball 4, with the exception of updated rosters and the addition of the Colorado Rockies and Florida Marlins, both of whom started play in 1993. But other than those two things, absolutely nothing changed. The graphics were exactly the same, the sound was exactly the same, the gameplay in various game modes were exactly the same. It was literally the same game as what was presented the previous year, in what was probably the laziest release that I've looked at in just over 300 episodes of doing this channel. Even when I've reviewed EA Sports games that went from the Genesis to the Sega CD, they at least included enhanced audio, video clips, and in the case of FIFA, additional teams, even if the rest of the game was largely the same. Tengen, I think knowing that this was potentially an issue, tried to address this on the rear cover of the game. At the top of the rear cover it states, "It's all new, better, faster, smoother, more real." And in the first bullet point, they specifically mentioned that the gameplay is supposedly twice as fast as R.B.I. Baseball 93, and that the animation for the players has been updated via rotoscoping. If this is all true, it would at least partially address my concerns from the previous game, so I went back to do an A to B comparison of the games from a graphical perspective, and to their credit, the batting-pitching interface, which is what you'll spend most of your time in, has been redone. The pitching and batting animations have been totally redrawn and are much smoother than in the previous game. Now that probably sounds like a good thing, and it mostly is, but along with the new animations, Tengen saw fit to introduce batter idle animations, where the batter will occasionally put forward a test swing while in the box waiting on the pitch. And while I get what they were going for, this would never happen in real life because then the pitcher could just throw the ball anywhere and have it called a strike. It's also incredibly distracting from a batting perspective because while you're trying to watch the pitch come in and decide whether to swing or not, your batter is just uncontrollably flailing away at the bottom of the screen. I have a hard time believing that was actually play-tested. You tend to get used to it so it doesn't totally ruin the game, but it's just an unnecessary feature and detracts from what's otherwise a definite improvement. One other note on the pitcher-batter interface, at the start of an at-bat, player pictures are now shown in the first and third base windows, including the players' names and base stats, which I almost enjoy more than the improved animation. It gives the batting interface almost a fighting game feel, with the batter on the left side of the screen and the pitcher on the right, as they're pitted against one another in a duel at the plate. Also, some of the pictures are fairly amusing, as they all appear to have been possibly originated as digitizations of real pictures, but then were touched up from an art perspective, and the end result in some cases is probably not what they were going for, i.e. I certainly wasn't expecting Mark McGwire to look like that. Unfortunately, it appears that the pitching-batting interface is the only place where the graphics have changed, at least as far as I can tell. The ball and fielders/runners do appear to move around a bit quicker than before, although I'm not sure if 50% faster, as it states on the back of the box, is accurate. The increase in speed is nice, but there's still going to be times where a ball is hit to the outfield and it takes a significant amount of time to go get the ball, much less throw it back to the infield. And of course, this is all being done on fields and stadiums that look identical to the previous game, or in this case, the previous two games. Now, I may be missing some small details, but I went so far as to compare the fans sitting in the stands, and it's clear that they're unchanged. Even the scoreboard shown at the end of each half inning is exactly the same as what came before, down to the pixel. So I guess from a graphics perspective, I'm landing on that, yes, the game has been improved from R.B.I. Baseball 93, but only meaningfully in the batter-pitcher interface and nowhere else. So Tengen didn't lie when calling the game better, faster, smoother, more real, but calling the game all new simply is not true. At least it's more effort than was put forth previously, I'll give them that. Let's move on to the sound. The back of the box states, more and high quality music, voices, and sounds featuring audio play assist by Jack Buck. If you're not aware, Jack Buck was a long-time play-by-play announcer for the St. Louis Cardinals, amongst other announcing duties, and was very notable when it comes to the position, to the point of being inducted into several halls of fame. But then again, it's also his fault that we've had to deal with his son Joe Buck on the air for the last 30 years, so I'm gonna temper my admiration a little bit. In all seriousness though, Tengen being able to say that they got a big baseball announcer like Jack Buck in their video game would normally be a huge selling point, very similar to what Hardball 3 did with adding Al Michaels to the game. Normally. Unfortunately, I think Tengen may have overstated Jack's involvement with the game a bit. In Hardball 3, Al Michaels acts as an announcer, very similar to how the Sports Talk announcer is used in Sports Talk Baseball. Al doesn't announce the entire game like as in Sports Talk, but he's there enough to where when he was removed from Hardball 94, his presence was definitely missed. Jack Buck doesn't have a presence like that in R.B.I. Baseball 94. Really, all he does is announce where the ball is hit, i.e. fly ball to right field, and everything else is just the standard umpire voice. Although, to their credit, the umpire speech samples are of higher quality than before. As far as Jack Buck's involvement goes, I suppose it's cool that they got a well-known name to do those specific voice samples, and they're not lying about his involvement, but anyone expecting him to act as an actual announcer here is going to be sorely disappointed. To me, I think the icing on the voiceover disappointment cake was his home run call.
He just kind of says, "Home run." Now, granted, I understand he was about 70 years old when these lines were recorded, and he probably had no clue what a video game was or how the clips were going to be used. They more than likely just stuck him in a booth for 30 minutes and told him to read some lines. But even still, it goes without saying that a home run is the most exciting thing in baseball, and to have it announced like that, I mean, I think it would have been better not to announce it at all and just throw in some extra fireworks or something. One last thing about sound effects and the difference between versions of the game. If you go into the options before the game, you can select what's called Crazy Ball mode. At first I thought this was maybe some version of the game that had weird physics, like pitches that were extra fast or curved more than usual, or maybe hits that bounced around excessive amounts like pinballs. But no, it's actually much more mundane than that. Instead, Crazy Ball mode is still your average R.B.I. Baseball 94 experience, except with goofy sound effects inserted into the game. It's fine, I guess, and probably an amusing experience for a game or so, but after that, it's going to get annoying. I'm a little surprised that they put this right into the game options, and it's not an Easter egg accessible with a password. It seems more fitting for that. Now, I've talked a lot about the sound effects in the game, what's been included, what's not been included, but one thing I haven't talked about yet is the music. In what was a nice surprise to me, the music is substantially improved from R.B.I. Baseball 93. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that I'd want a soundtrack album based on R.B.I. Baseball 94, but there are some really nice tunes here, which are a deviation from the ballpark-inspired music that came before. So, full credit to Tengen here. Even though I think they bait and switch Jack Buck's involvement with the game slightly, the sound effects and music are both clearly improved from the previous title. So, we've gone over the graphics and music. What else has changed from the previous year? Well, unfortunately, nothing really meaningful. And, it's possible that I'm missing small details, but more or less, the game is structured exactly the same. You've got Home Run Derby, single game mode, and then the same best of 7 partial and full season modes. So there's no custom players, no player trades, no team customization, and no game-to-game stat tracking. Oh, and that real schedule feature I was happy to see on the back of the box? Well, it's present, but you can't actually look at the schedule to see where you're at on it, what games are coming up, what happened in the past, etc. Probably the most egregious sin that the game commits is this is now the 4th edition of the game on the Genesis to still rely on passwords. Now, this is something I have a hard time fathoming. You go through the trouble to improve the graphics, at least partially, and the sound, but you can't throw a battery on the cartridge so we don't have to deal with these crazy passwords anymore that, oh by the way, depending on the password, don't even fit completely on the password entry screen. That threw me for a bit the first time I went to enter one, as by default, it doesn't appear that there's enough slots for your password, which then leads to another problem of, well, what happens if you miss a character, but you can't see the whole password on the screen at once to know which one you got wrong? The reliance on passwords is also why none of those other features I mentioned were added to the game, as the passwords couldn't cover saving games besides win-loss records. Seeing a sports title that's marketed at least partially as a baseball sim without proper save games in April of 1994 is a bit tough to stomach. So where did I land with R.B.I. Baseball 94? Well, it's definitely the best game in the R.B.I. Baseball series to appear on the Genesis. And after the disaster that was R.B.I. Baseball 93, Tengen at least understood that they needed to make some improvements to the game, and they did. There's no arguing that. But just because you release a game that's better than something that I regarded as being a complete embarrassment, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've worked your way all the way up to being a good game. I mean, there was a lot of room for improvement here that we've seen in other sports titles. In the end, I'm going to give R.B.I. Baseball 94 2 stars. It's not a bad game. It has the same tried and true, and possibly stale, R.B.I. Baseball arcade gameplay, but it simply needed to have more than just a new coat of paint to compete with the better baseball games on the market in 1994.
And that's it for R.B.I. Baseball 94 on the Genesis. Going into this review, I was a bit worried that I wouldn't have a whole lot to talk about with now covering this series for the 4th time, especially with how little the game had changed between the previous 2 iterations. Or, I mean, hell, the entire time, really. In a lot of ways, this is still the same R.B.I. baseball that debuted on the NES in 1987, which probably speaks to how good the series was originally at representing the game of baseball. But, things change, times change, and not unlike the abbreviated 1994 MLB season, R.B.I. Baseball 94 just doesn't do quite enough to successfully get over the finish line, especially in comparison to a certain 800-pound gorilla of a baseball game that Sega had released that same month. Now, next up on the channel, I had originally scheduled another Genesis sports game based on my 100-episode rule, but I think, maybe this time we'll make a slight adjustment and flip-flop the next two games on the schedule to avoid that, as, I'd really prefer the YouTube algorithm to not beat up on the channel too badly. I mean, I'm good with being a small niche channel, but there are some things I can do to not actively hinder my success. In fact, I can just imagine how badly the numbers might have looked had I gone with the previous schedule. I think the metrics could have been pretty raw, if you know what I mean. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 306. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!